Hello. I wanted to talk about how you can use rose hips this fall. And I use rose hips in a variety of different ways. One of the ways that I use rose hips is I gather a whole bunch of them and I dry them for nourishing herbal infusions for the winter. And how I do this is I take an ounce of dried rose hips by weight. I put them in a quart-sized jar. I pour boiling water on top of that, give it a stir, put a tight lid on it, and I let it steep 4 to 6 hours or overnight. Then in the morning, I strain out the rose hips and compost them. And then I take my infusion and I pop that in the fridge. Rosehip infusion is high in vitamin C. It has flavonoids, which are wonderful for anti-inflammatory properties. And it also tastes really good. So rosehip infusion is a wonderful way to use up rose hips. Another thing I like to do with rose hips is I like to make a syrup. So rosehip syrup, and you can use the rosehip infusion to make a syrup by turning it into an herbal decoction, but you can also use the rose hips fresh to make the rosehip syrup, which is actually what I prefer. So if you want to learn how to make a syrup, go check out my elderberry video, and you basically do everything exactly the same except you're subbing in rose hips for elderberries. It's the same method. Another thing that I like to do with rose hips is I like to make rosehip honey. Rosehip honey is really nice if you have a sore throat. It's also just totally delicious. So even if you don't have a sore throat, even if you don't have a cold, rosehip honey tastes wonderful. And so what I do is I cut open the rose hips. This is a little more labor intensive. So you cut open each rose hip, you scrape out the hairs and the seeds, and then you put them in a jar and pour honey on top. You want to make sure that your rose hips aren't too soggy for this and that you harvested them on a dry day, because water and honey do not mix well and your honey will ferment if the rose hips are too damp. So dry, hot, sunny day, nice and firm, and then you pour the honey on top once your jar is full, like I said, and stir out the air bubbles. You let that honey sit somewhere cool and dark, and then in 6 weeks your rosehip honey is ready and delicious. Another thing that I like to do with rose hips is I make rosehip oil. So to make rosehip oil, I chop up the rose hips. I don't bother taking out the seeds or the hairs because you're going to strain it all out anyway. I fill my jar with rose hips that have been chopped up. I pour olive oil on top. I stir out any air bubbles. Again, you want to make sure your rose hips are not too soggy and that you harvested them on a dry day because water and oil don't do well together either. And I let my rose hips sit in the oil for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, my rosehip oil is ready and I strain it. And I use the oil for breast self-massage and to help moisturize my face or my hands. It's a wonderful, gentle herbal remedy.